You can help Deconstructing Comics by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week.
This is Kumar.
And this is Koom.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Kumar in Melbourne, Koom in Toronto.
Yep.
We're going to talk about Give Me Liberty today by Frank Miller and Dave Gibbons. The intention was that we record this in time, or to release this episode before the upcoming U.S. election.
Is that still a possibility, Kumar?
I don't think so. I think we're recording it a few weeks before, but I think the way the release schedule is going to work, when people are listening to this, their lives are going to be in ruins.
Yeah,
one way or the
other. There might be no more internet. There might be no. There might it might be martial law and chaos.
Yeah.
Which is ironically what happens in the graphic novel we're discussing. So, what we should do is we should pretend it's after the election, and we should imagine the most dire consequences that can happen, and then talk as if they're happening. That's my proposal for tonight.
That's maybe the best approach. Is just to assume that everything in the book is it's real.
Okay, so Kumar, I'm talking to you from the underground. President Trump, south of us, has declared that nobody is allowed to have any kind of free speech whatsoever. So we are recording this on the sly on pirate radio. Canada, as you know, as you've heard, is already under siege from the States. We've had to do the best we can with our much more minuscule cache of arms and military know-how compared to the States. As you know, you're on the other side of the world, so this ripple hasn't hit you yet. But, you're going to feel the repercussions of this in about a week or two. So, Kumar, I'm depending on you to get this message out.
Okay.
All right. Because Frank Miller, given all his flaws, has been somewhat prophetic in that 1990 work that he did with Dave Gibbons, Give Me Liberty, about what has happened, this dire circumstance that has happened.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Although the series starts in 1995. Martha Washington, the lead, is born in 1995, and things are already much worse than they were in 1990. So I think Frank Miller must have thought things were already on the way to complete utter horror. They were only 5 years away from everything going to hell.
Yeah, I don't know how serious he was because he can exaggerate things, but I'll tell you an interesting anecdote. I was, as you know, I teach high school, and one of the courses I teach is civics. So we were studying law, and we're preparing for a mock trial. So I was showing the kids A Few Good Men, which incidentally also came out in 1990. And we're watching the film, and then there's this part where, I don't know if you've seen the film, but it's a great, military
I've seen it.
Yeah, when the Tom Cruise character is interrogating the Kiefer Sutherland character, and he's like, yeah, but it wasn't a real order. You just told the guy not to give him any food for a week. It wasn't like you told him to take a hill, or it wasn't like you were securing a beachhead. I mean, this wasn't a real order. I mean, we're in peacetime. And the kids are all watching this, and they don't register. But to me, I'm thinking, oh my God, when I was their age, exactly pretty much, in 1990, America was at peace, at least officially. There was no First Iraqi war, no second
right.
Iraqi war, no Afghanistan, no mess in the Middle East, no ISIS. I mean, Jesus Christ. It's just amazing what a difference there is. Just that one line in the movie took me back to 1990, the time when Give Me Liberty came out. And I was like, man, the economy was so much better. I mean, things look rosy,
Yeah.
relatively.
So, yeah, I guess. I don't know if I'd use the word rosy.
Yeah,
but,
I might be exaggerating, but
But, okay, so, I want to talk about why you wanted, this is your choice, and I want to get, maybe we kind of already, that is the reason, but why you wanted to do it. And also, you've been trying to get me to like Frank Miller more than I like him.
Yeah.
For as long as I've known you.
Yeah.
And, you even added me to the Frank Miller Facebook fan page, and I immediately, within 5 minutes, I scrolled through about 2 pictures, and I was like, nah, and I got myself out of it.
Yeah.
So what was
I figured you did, because I never heard from you after that, and I didn't know if our friendship was over, but I guess it's still
seriously, man, I just clicked on the link, I scrolled through about 2 pictures, and literally, it's called the Frank Miller Appreciation page or something, and I saw there was like 2 covers, and I don't know if you saw the new Dark Knight cover that was released a day or 2 ago, but it's just like, it's the worst, like, it's so bad.
Okay, now I'll probably end up posting this podcast to the Frank Miller Appreciation page. So it'll be kind of interesting because, that page, like when I joined, which was fairly recently, there was a little bit of talk or discussion, or you might even say mild controversy, about how to approach Frank Miller. Some people were saying we should only laud Frank Miller. This is the Frank Miller Appreciation page. And people are slamming Frank Miller on this, etc., etc. And I had to sort of like say something because, I'm an idiot and I can't keep my mouth shut. And I said, I love Frank as much as anybody, but I have to be honest and say, I do think he lost his way, during the 90s with the Sin City stuff. So to get back to your original question, there are a few reasons that I love this book. One is I think it's the last of his great works. It comes in at the very tail end of the 80s. And it's in my opinion, it's a wonderful book. I mean, nothing's perfect, but it's great. I did anticipate that we might have a sort of a Siskel and Ebert kind of thing where I'd be defending Frank Miller, whereas you might be criticizing him at least more. But I think it's also interesting because Miller is sort of at this point in his career where I think it's obvious to most people that he's not really able to generate the artistic output that he once was able to do. There's obviously been a lot of talk about his health. So we're looking at somebody who is or in the process of being somewhat canonized, right? And it's a problematic legacy, but he's one of the greats. He's one of the big pillars. And it sort of also comes at a time when Alan Moore says that he's leaving comics. And I think these two people sort of defined, for me at least, the 80s and all of that stuff. Like, they were right at the center of things. And I think Frank Miller, as a writer, is the only person who could give Alan Moore a run for his money. Although I don't really want to get sidetracked into that discussion of who's the better writer, because I think that's kind of fruitless. But I just think, like, to me, Miller is a fascinating entity. And then the last reason was, of course, the U.S. election. I thought we could try to tie it into the U.S. election, but things have transpired to the point where it's just ridiculous. And I don't know if you watched the final debate on Wednesday, but I was feeling the fatigue and the sickness at the end. I mean, I was riveted. And then at the end, I was just like, oh, God, please, just let it blow away, please, because you're just getting to that point. Yet, Trump is like a character out of Frank Miller. I mean, he talks like a character out of Frank Miller. He paints a vision of America that's like out of Frank Miller. He could potentially take things in that direction if he was given any amount of control. But I thought that might be interesting. I don't know if it still is at this point. I mean, people might just be sick of that. But that was my intention when I proposed ages ago. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of, I'm thinking of at least 3 diverging threads off of here. One is where you talked about how this was maybe his last great work.
Yeah.
As you know, I'm a fan of the first 2 Sin City books. I
Sure.
really do love those.
Sure.
But, I think definitely this one is particularly interesting because with Martha Washington series in particular, they get progressively worse.
I agree with you. The other 2 big works are like he's already lost it. Whatever it is that Miller had, that was brilliant.
Well, yeah, and I mean, there's not 2 and 3. I can't remember what they're called. Martha Washington Goes to War and Martha Washington
In space.
in Space.
Yeah. I'll take a look. It's Martha Washington Saves the World.
Okay, Saves the World, right. So, I think In Space was a one-shot. There were a couple of one-shot collections of shorts that had appeared in other places. So, they're not categorically bad, but there's no satire in them. It's almost, you can almost compare it to the RoboCop series, which Frank Miller also worked on.
Yeah.
Where the first one had that kind of satire, and the second 2 were just adventures starring RoboCop.
I would disagree with that because I would lump RoboCop 2 at least sort of at the tail end of his good period. To me, it's got redeeming aspects and it's very satirical. I don't know if you had a chance to watch it again, but he takes the satire in one and he makes it even more kind of cartoony. He's got these like amazing ads in it. Like RoboCop 2 begins. It's just like one of these movies that's not like a great film, but I love for many reasons. Okay. It begins with like this log tracking shot, and then it's got like a bag lady like going, and then somebody beats her up and takes her stuff, and then somebody like beats up that person, and then uses the money to buy drugs, and the 2 hookers come along and beat him. Like it's got a really funny, wonderful satire. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I should be talking about RoboCop 3. But anyway.
Yeah, RoboCop 3 sucks. But you've also got to
remember that
they really bastardized his stuff for RoboCop 2. And
yes.
You got to keep that in mind.
But he was in charge of 3. And it's interesting, too, because there's a character in there called Bertha in RoboCop 3 who seems very much like Martha, I thought.
Well, you've also got to remember Casey McKenna from Ronin, who's very much like Martha.
Right, okay.
Remember Kate, the love interest, who's also black and a soldier?
Yeah.
And
Right. Okay, so the other thing I was trying to get to there was the last Martha Washington, which came out, which is a one-shot called Martha Washington Dies, came out just last year or something. And it's awful. It's like a 16-page thing. Most of them are one-page shots, like full-page splashes. And I literally read it on the stand at the comic shop. It took me about 3 minutes.
Sure.
And it was just the most throwaway, pathetic ending to the Martha Washington saga. So there's that kind of aspect of it.
Yeah, it wasn't a year ago. It was definitely like years ago. But by that time she'd become full into jingoism mode, right? Like.
Well, but there's not even any of that aspect of it. It's just this kind of non-story. It's like a story that could have been told in one page almost, where she just becomes some kind of space being and goes. It's nonsense. But anyway, the other thing was I think the Alan Moore comparison. I think actually, as I was reading this and remembering the later ones, thinking Garth Ennis would have really killed it. Like he would have knocked it out of the Martha Washington series out of the ballpark.
There is that similarity. You're right in a sense, except that's another place where we differ. Like I know you love Ennis, and I don't. I don't like hate him, but I sort of, I see him as doing this particular thing, and I think Miller's stuff is like way more interesting and nuanced and hard to pin down, and like I don't know than Ennis.
Yes, at this stage, but I think when you get to the subsequent series and it's just it's just military adventures, Garth Ennis does that way better than Frank Miller does in the subsequent Martha Washington books is what I'm trying to kind of get at. And it's funny, it's strange too because in the later books like there's no swearing, like it's just very stuff that was kind of gritty in the first Martha Washington book is not there. It's like almost watered down. There's some kind of very strange process happening there.
Yeah.
Especially because he was real like anti-censorship at that time and was, I don't know what really happened to the series, but it lost its teeth for sure.
But that's, to me, like, also what happened with Sin City. Not the lack of swearing, exactly, but more like his writing lost its teeth and its grit and its tension and his ability to write characters and stories that would surprise you and would give you complexity. Now, the thing is, I didn't read, or I should say I shouldn't reread, because of course I read them. I didn't reread anything else except Give Me Liberty. And I'll concede to you, like, I will probably blanket agree with everything you say about the subsequent stuff. So I would say let's focus on the first, because I think it stands alone, and I think, like, of the various threads we talked about, I think the thing most worth talking about is the legacy of Frank Miller, and what we should do with, like, for me, it's a conflicted thing, because politically and, like, morally, I really find it very difficult, but lately I've sort of, like, developed a sort of, like, a warmth again, because I've just been seeing that he's been doing these new, like, little videos and interviews. Like, he was at the Kubert School for a long interview, talking to students and stuff, and there's something about me that goes out to him, and I don't want to see the baby thrown out with the bathwater just because he lost it in different ways, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, another question I asked on the Frank Miller group, which a couple of people responded to, is why is Martha Washington ignored? I think she's an awesome character, and the first series is an amazing work of art. And we've got to remember Gibbons' contribution too. He's a phenomenal artist, and it's got shades of Watchmen because of that. Whereas Elektra is like super, super, super famous, but like Martha Washington's just as tough and, you know, interesting in her own way.
Oh yeah,
right.
And more beyond that. I mean, Martha Washington, the character. I mean, here we've got a comic in the first, all of them. The three lead characters are a black female 16-year-old initially.
Yeah.
A Native American boyfriend.
Yeah.
And a female schizophrenic mutant thing.
Yeah. Psychic.
This is what, right now, for the past 5-10 years, people, the big two at least, have been desperately trying to put together comics that feature anything remotely approaching this level of diversity. And it's always like, there's always like a news story when, we have a black female character or whatever. And I'm like, I was reading this time and I was like, he was doing this in 1990.
Well, not only like the rest of the world, but also like much of the criticism against Frank Miller, and sometimes quite justified so, is for his misogyny or for his retrograde values.
Yes.
And that wasn't all there was to him. There was so much more if you take the time to go and comb back through the good stuff in the 80s.
Well, for sure, but he started distilling stuff. There was, especially when Sin City was his baby, he was like, okay, I can take out anything that's not Mickey Spillane, and just leave this crusty essence of the most hard-boiled thing he could come up with. Yeah. And I think that's where that kind of, those misogynistic aspects and stuff come out. There's another problem here where we have this character who's very marginalized and disenfranchised. She's come out of this slum, Cabrini Green, where if you've read interviews with Frank Miller recently, especially those couple that came out 3 or 4 years ago, it's hard to imagine him having any sympathy today with this character anymore.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? It seems like this would be the kind of person that he would think is actually ruining the country.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a bit of assumption but based on reading the interview, that's what the impression you kind of get from it, that I got.
So the great tragedy is not that Frank Miller is necessarily a misogynist or is obtuse or is ultra right wing. But the great tragedy is that once he was not those things, or he actually like had a satirical view, he had a detachment, he had a rich interest in the world and a detachment that could like play around with those ideas. And by the time, for me, the transition book is the first Sin City, and that's the one I remember just as a teenager reading that stuff and going, you know what, this is really rich and powerful visually, and there's some really interesting like directions here, but there's already something about this I don't like. And by the time he did A Dame to Kill For, I could just feel like there was something unsatisfactory about it, although the art was really beautiful and stuff. And then the art gets more blunt and like less interesting and so on, and then it becomes a progression. So for me, like Sin City is the tipping point. But I guess, I don't know, like, do you want to do a summary? Because I know sometimes you do a summary of what happened.
I was just thinking that, so we should talk about what the book is about. So it's set 5 years in the future, in 1995, initially.
Yeah.
And this baby is born, Martha Washington. She's, as I said, she's born in a very poor slum. Meanwhile, up in the 1% range, the president has changed the Constitution. He's made an amendment so that he can serve more than 2 terms, and he just stays in there for years and years and years. And meanwhile, she's growing up. Life is hell in the slum. She's on the run from rape gangs and stuff all the time. And
they sleep in dormitories, kind of almost like a concentration camp.
Yeah, and it's super violent. But she's also a computer whiz. She's able to hack computers super easily. Also in the background, there's a peacekeeping force called PAX, which her older brother joins and then never comes back from.
Yeah.
She ends up killing a guy in self-defense, which drives her temporarily insane, let's say.
Yeah.
And because of that, she's institutionalized, and then she gets out, and I think she kills some other people getting out. And then what happens is she gets out, she doesn't get out. The government cuts funding to these health institutions, so they have to release people onto the street. So what they do is they set up these health gangs. I can't remember what exactly they're called, but they're basically guys that go around with injections and killing former inmates on the streets. And she kills one of these guys, and she escapes, and she manages to hack a ATM, which fortunately has a full keyboard for some reason.
Yeah.
But anyway,
it's really like a Superman 3 kind of moment. It's like a Gus Gordon.
Right.
You know?
Right. Right. That's another thing. I want to talk about all the fingerprints of everything else before and after that are on this book, because I think that's kind of an amazing thing about it, which maybe was not intended, or I don't know. Anyway, so she ends up joining PAX, because when you join PAX, you get a clean slate. They clear your record. So she joins this peacekeeping force, but then her CO is this. There's another great thing. So they send her off to the Amazon rainforest, because there's a whole other plot here, which we have to talk about, which is the president, who is this kind of Republican Ronald Reagan type.
That's right.
Very handsome.
He's called Rex.
Super charismatic.
Yeah. But he's for sure.
Yeah. So he gets the White House gets bombed, and the whole cabinet dies except one guy who was out sick, who is this super liberal, left-wing type, and he's like, okay, we're going to save the Amazon from the burger corporations, and the burger corporations is kind of giant, they've got their own armies, right?
He becomes the new president, right? Everybody else is gone.
He becomes the new president, that's right. So he becomes the new president, and he starts all these radical reforms, like he's going to save the rainforest, and all these kind of, tree-hugging kind of, things. It's like a breath of fresh air. This guy's completely the opposite of the previous administration, who was kind of, toe the line kind of guy, or whatever. So, anyway, she gets sitting down to the rainforest. Her CO turns out to be totally corrupt, and he's there to destroy the rainforest instead of save it. I mean, he cuts a deal with the local, the hamster corporation.
He's got an Italian name, but he sort of seems to come from a WASP background, and he comes from a background of privilege, and he's just very smug and arrogant and ambitious and totally unscrupulous, right?
Right, and she almost kills him, like she stops him from burning down the rainforest, but he survives, and he becomes obsessed with kind of destroying her over and over again. So that's basic.
We should say also that, this is a very satirical, surreal kind of future, and part of that future is like the technology is pretty. So she basically she knifes him in the chest, like in the lung, and of course, like normally somebody would die, but in this future, his family's so rich that they've just bought him a new state-of-the-art lung, and he's going to be totally fine. And there's like a few times that Martha is completely rebuilt, with the various new technologies available. So this is a fantasy where people can be rebuilt pretty much from scratch almost.
Right. Okay. So that's almost the first issue. So there's 4 issues in the original series.
But it basically sets up the tension or the main conflict between Martha, this very poor person who comes from the slums, and Moretti, who she stops, but because he ends up living, he ends up being decorated as a hero because they assume that he was there also helping Martha. They're actually fighting the Fat Boy Burger Company, which is obviously a takeoff on Big Boy Burgers, and it's kind of crazy because basically they just want to, the Fat Boy Burger Company has its own militia, its own army, and it just wants to destroy the rainforest, put cows out to pasture, and so the Pax forces are being sent by this new idealistic president called Nissen, and they're fighting this corporation's like militia, and the militia, they're like in giant Fat Boy kind of automatons. It's crazy. Like, you have to read this to really get a sense of how crazy things are.
Yeah. There's a couple of other plot points I wanted to cover from the later issues because I think they're worth talking about in more detail later on. But one is that the new guy Nissen, this bleeding heart liberal type who takes over as president, they end up manipulating him. They turn him into a drunk, and so they can get him to sign these deals or whatever, and he loses control. He becomes just this pathetic loser.
Well, first he starts off really idealistic, but he can't handle the pressure of the job and the constant criticism.
Yes.
And so
Sorry, go ahead.
He starts off being like this wonderful, clean-cut kind of person you just like, and by the end of his arc, he's like overweight, his wife's left him, he's sleeping with like some presidential aide or a butler or somebody, and then he's drunk out of his mind, and basically Moretti by that point, who survived the Amazon thing and has become promoted, has built his own kind of network to seize power and manipulate Nissen and basically get control of power. And then they have this wonderful, it's like the assassination of Caesar. He's already manipulated Nissen into basically in a drunken stupor, killing his vice president, who's trying to talk reason to him, and then signing an executive order to destroy the Apache Nation, right? A bunch of Native Indians who are militant and, protest the Americans' breaking of their treaties and all of that. And then they have this great scene where, like, the various people around the president just kind of come out with long knives and then just stick him like they do Caesar. And then Moretti has them killed. And what's wonderful is, like, Moretti's blown up too after and I don't know if you noticed this, but he's upside down in the car and he's just smiling and he's grinning. Yeah. Like, that's how surreal things are. He's like, I always wear my seatbelt,
Another point I wanted to dig into there was about the Apache
Nation
tribe, the Apache Nation. So Nissen gets into power, and so a year or two previously, the Apaches had held a siege around this oil refinery on their land, what was traditionally their land, and said that the treaty had been violated and it should belong to them. When Nissen comes into power, he just hands over the oil refinery.
Yeah.
The problem is this backfires because people are turning to solar and other power sources anyway, and this refinery's old technology, and it just belches out these toxic fumes, and the whole Apache Nation becomes sick and weakened.
What's great is when they paint their faces red in a kind of hearkening to the kind of pride they once had.
Yeah.
Because their skin is so sallow, you know? Yeah.
Sorry. Right. No, sorry. The thing that was reading this in 2016, this business about Nissen, because he screws up the decision with the Apaches, and then he is easily manipulated into becoming this drunk.
Yeah.
And signing whatever they want him to sign, and he's just a puppet. He becomes a puppet. And I felt, looking at this now, it feels like Miller had no sympathy for the liberal type. Like, this type of person would be a horrible president almost, is what I feel like the message is there.
Yeah, let's talk about the message, because I think, like, there is a criticism by Miller of extremely, bleeding heart kind of liberal types. And if you remember Electra Assassin, there's a very democratic style president called Ken Wind, who just turns out to be the beast, like the most evil kind of thing, with this like face of this Robert Kennedy type face, So there is a kind of consistency, and of course in The Dark Knight Returns, there's a kind of an ironic commentary on both liberal values and conservative. And I think that comes out here because the villain is your typical Republican, conservative, ambitious person. And then Rexall is your typical, establishment politician, the kind of person that Trump criticizes, right? I mean, he's a horrible leader, and yet you're constantly told, that's another thing I love about this book, like the constant playful disjunction between what you see happening in the panels and the commentary in the boxes. And it's often said that Rexall is this really, popular president, and then yet as they repeat certain motifs again and again, and you see him like, in a parade, and he's constantly armed more and more and more and protected more and more and more by flanks of like armed guards. And what I love at the end is, you said that he was blown up. Well, they preserve his brain, and he's put in this like little motorized, like little robotic capsule thing. He's just like a brain, and he's still like his cheery kind of glib Reagan style thing. And at the very end, he's reinstated as the president, and he's just like this brain and a thing, like cheering, going down the parade with like flanks of soldiers. And so the book never ultimately like gives you that catharsis or that kind of revolution that you might expect in a more earnest work. He seems to think that all politics is just kind of stupid. And what Miller goes for time and time again is a kind of lone hero who can find his or her way through that. And so I always feel like he's got, like even though he's like known for the noir sensibility, he creates these heroes, at least in the earlier part of his career, that are more sort of Western type heroes. They're people who are like on the frontier, and ultimately there's a value in just having that kind of personal fortitude and integrity, or personal, code of values, even though it's not as expansive enough to include politics and the world and stuff, because the rest of it's just crazy, and surreal.
Yeah, totally. And I think, but I don't know if this is maybe in contrast to that kind of cowboy frontier kind of thing, but in the first issue, twice Martha uses the line, "I don't give him any shit." Yeah. Once it's when she's, it's one of the things I loved most about the whole, I thought it was the deepest thing, was first it's when she's a little kid and she's on the run from the gangs, and somebody says, "Don't give me any shit," and she says, "I don't give him any shit," and that's how she survives. And at the very end of the first issue, after she's stabbed Moretti and he survives, and he comes to her in the hospital and he says, "Don't give me any shit," and she says, "I don't give him any shit," and it's the last line of issue 1, and it's very
poignant.
I don't know how to describe it. Yeah, but it is poignant. Yeah, totally. It's the only way she can survive is to keep her head down and do what she's told.
That's what makes Miller brilliant. Is because it ends on that note where we can all relate to it. Like, no matter how tough you are, she's ultimately somebody who's defined by where she was born and her options and choices in life, and also her self-image, right? I mean, it's the fact that she has to deal with the fact that she can't win in those circumstances. And so to some degree she's not the all-American hero. She has to acknowledge, and I think it echoes the very end of the book where she goes to like Moretti's cell. And what I was thinking as I was rereading the last chapter was, you got this whole fight sequence. It builds up to this climax where she finally faces Moretti and his goons, and she's aided by the Native American guy. And it's sort of like, it's a very comic booky thing that Frank Miller did exceedingly well, like way better than Garth Ennis, in my opinion, way better than many people. And then I was like, you know what? Like, it's cool and his skill is evident, but what I really like is that other thing that you were just talking about. And then it ends with that thing in the cell, which is only like 2 pages, but it just takes you back to that place. That's so powerful.
Yeah.
That's so powerful.
Totally. Yeah, it is. And there's maybe it's powerful or not powerful. What did you think? There's a panther motif that comes up again and again, which is initially when she's in the jungle in issue 1 and she's almost dying. This panther starts circling her but leaves her alone, and then comes back and sniffs her and then leaves her alone, and finally she's rescued or whatever. But later on, through subsequent issues, sometimes you get a shot of the panther as a kind of analog to Martha herself.
Towards the end, like Moretti's a white hunter and she's the panther.
Right, and also when at one point she's held, Wasserstein, the Native American, holds her, and he says, panther, of course, so it's her spirit animal, like he senses it as well.
And he's an he's an eagle, right?
Right. So did you feel like, did you feel like that worked, or
it's funny, if I was reading
your 5 cents on
the
that?
First time now, I might think it's too much, except I think like Frank Miller does those big ideas or those big feelings very well, so maybe it's not out of keeping with what he's doing. But when I read it for the first time as a teenager, I was totally fine with it, and so because of that, I think I'm still okay with it. You know, like when we read these things in our formative years, they tend to stay with us in a certain way.
Back to Kumar and Koom in a moment. Koom asked me to correct his statement that A Few Good Men was released in 1990. It was actually 1992. Now, if you value the content on Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Polls, and want to help us move up to bigger and better things, how about donating a few bucks a month via Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. If everyone listening gave just $3 a month, it would make a big difference. We'd be able to reach several of our Patreon goals and bring you more content. I'll tell you again, there are over 120 episodes that are currently missing from our website, which we'll gradually make available again as we reach our upcoming goals. The first goal is just $9 away, so how about helping us out? We'd really appreciate it if everyone pitched in a few bucks a month to get us to those goals, so that we can re-release those early episodes.
I'm Batman.
And I'm Robin.
This is Tim.
And this is Paul. To the Bat Polls!
The iTunes reviews are in on To the Bat Polls podcast. These guys do a good job, writes Acello. Who knew that the Batman TV show was such a wellspring of insight into Hollywood trivia, 60s counterculture, sexual mores, and even musical analysis? The Young brothers know their stuff, says Professor Allen. It is a great mix of nostalgia, analysis, and fun. Highly recommended. You've heard the reviews, now try it for yourself. New episodes on the first, third, and fifth Thursdays of the month on iTunes or Stitcher, or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com.
Batman, the answer to a policeman's prayer.
For nostalgia, analysis, and fun, it's
To the Bat Polls.
I mean, whether you argue like it's too much or not, what I do like about it is that there are various times in the book where he just gives you this jarring transition, or it's not even a transition, it's just a slide into a different reality. Like, for example, he'll just only have a two-page spread in a magazine, and unlike other stuff that does that, he won't give you the whole article. He'll just give you this like part of an article, and then it slides back into the story.
It's part of the tapestry.
Yeah, but it's not like it's not a smooth kind of collating of the edges. And so for me, the animal motifs of the symbolism was like that too. Just, it's like a director suddenly like putting on an extreme filter. But I think what he's doing is always interesting and lively, so I don't mind it. But what did you think?
I thought, well, I reread the book twice for this podcast. And I think sometimes, I think it works. And I think the reason it works is when you see the panther, it's the panther in the jungle, the original jungle. It's not a panther. It's not Martha as a panther in the park where she's now or wherever she is now or in this room. It's a shot of the jungle. And like when she attacks Moretti at the end, Moretti is dressed as a safari hunter. He's not dressed in his military gear. So, I think that, I don't know, maybe it works in some occasions and on others, or I'm not, I really didn't know. That's why I had to ask. Like, I would like somebody else's opinion on it.
I don't know if you noticed, but the first chapter is subtly different from the other chapters of the rest of the book.
Yes.
For me, the part that really stands out is that 2-page spread where they're both just silent panels, and one is sort of like a semi-long shot where she's just sitting crying on the tree trunk after she's waded through the mustard gas or the napalm or whatever it is, and then she's in the forest, and then the next page, once again, one of these jarring things, but it's just amazingly strong and beautiful. It's not totally silent. It says, "This won't kill me. I won't die here. This won't kill me." Is when she wipes the tear away, and you just see that expression on her face. And it's just so powerful. And it's a close-up. And just that spread and that moment in the jungle. And if you look at the art in that, there's so much more texture. Not so much more, but there's a significant amount of texture. There's something different about it than in the later chapters. And I don't know if you knew this, but originally when Dave Gibbons did the art for that, he did it massive because they thought that they were going to make it into an oversized edition, kind of like the Killing Joke was planned to be. And so the art for the first issue is done like twice the size. And so it's the colors are subtly different, and also the art has more textures, and it's got a kind of like a gravitas, like sort of, it's got some action, but it's just got, I don't know, it's just got the strength that's amazing. And so when I was in England, I tried to get a hold of Gibbons's art agent, and I said, because I think it's a shame this book isn't considered as great as some of his others, but it also meant that I could maybe try to buy a page from it, because usually I can't afford to buy anything that famous, and then it's like the most. Like he had a few left from that first issue, and it's the most expensive thing I've ever bought, but it's huge. And what's odd about it is it's not exactly like what's in the book, because Gibbons actually drew the panels in different like they're not all on one page. And so what he ended up doing is when they decided to scrap the plan to make it an oversized thing, he sort of stuck the panels together on these giant pages to sell them off, I guess. So what I have is this odd thing that's not exactly the same as it's in the book, but is the original art for it.
Okay.
Interesting. Anyway, so I don't know if you noticed that the first issue is somewhat subtly different.
Right.
Sorry, I feel like I got us way off course, but...
No, that's all. No, it's good to get into the nuts and bolts of it. Because art is great, and also, especially his drawings of Martha are...
I know. She's so real.
Are really... She's powerful.
And she's
consistently.
real.
Yeah, and just the strength in her face and in her body language and the way she stands is really great. And I wonder, too, how... maybe we should start talking about the fingerprints a little bit, because I wonder how, because you mentioned all the magazine articles and stuff, and that kind of reminds you of Watchmen.
I knew you were going to say that. I think Watchmen but you got to keep in mind that Watchmen is to a great degree Dave Gibbons as well. It's not just more.
Yeah. Oh, sure. But that's what I'm saying. Is that why Frank Miller chose Dave Gibbons for this, was because he had the vision of it being kind of multimedia kind of thing, and he thought Dave Gibbons would be good at this, or, I felt like there was a little bit of that there.
Well, I wouldn't say that like Frank Miller is averse to multimedia stuff. Like even as early as Moore, he was doing that. For example, Dark Knight, one of the
TVs.
Sorry.
The TVs. He uses that.
You got it. Yeah. That's one of Miller's shorthands. It's there in RoboCop. It's there in Dark Knight. It's there in Martha Washington.
Did he use it in Daredevil as well?
Yeah, he used it, but not to quite this. Not like totally as a narrative tool that would just frame everything. But it was there. Yeah. It was there. It set something up. Like there's a crime and Bullseye's escaped, and then like Daredevil's listening to it and whatever. And he uses the talking heads, right? But he uses Pastiche and Electra Assassin like quite a bit. I think what I would say is that despite like Frank Miller kind of being considered this great writer cartoonist, he's also a great artist writer. And there's a period in his life where he produces these really rich things. He works with Mazzucchelli, he works with Sienkiewicz, he works with Gibbons. I don't know if I'm like missing anybody else, but he's able to work with them and then produce these like unique collaborations. Sort of like, Moore is famous for like analyzing what's great about the artists he works with and then writing to their strengths. I don't think Miller's doing that exactly, but I think he's adapting and working in a partnership with them as opposed to saying, I'm Frank Miller and you're going to draw my stuff, because I'm really busy. I think he's actually like, working with these people in really interesting ways. And if you see the notes that Gibbons puts in the omnibus, you really get the feeling that Gibbons was like totally like geared up for it and invested.
Can I go on a tangent about that specifically about Miller and his artists?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which will maybe will go against everything you say, but maybe dovetail right into it. Okay, two works I want to talk about are Electra Assassin and Hard Boiled, because in both cases, I might have talked about this on the show before, but he got sideswiped by the artist. So in the case with Electra Assassin, the pages came back from Sienkiewicz, and he was like, I don't know what to do with this, and he reordered the pages and rewrote the book.
Yes. Based
around the craziness of the art being nothing like what he wrote. And similarly with Hard Boiled, the art came back from Jeff Darrow, and Darrow had gone over the top and had like license plates sticking out of Nixon's legs and stuff. And initially, Nixon was not a robot, and it's only 3 issues, he was not a robot, and the art came back, and Frank Miller was like, this guy can't be human, I'm going to have to rewrite this so he's a robot. So from issue 2 onwards, it's like, okay, now the guy's a robot or whatever. You know what I mean?
But I think that's great. That's amazing.
It is great, but I feel like sometimes, and I think this book is completely the opposite, but I think sometimes Miller's artists are just like, they go off in outer space and come back, and then it's like, they got to scratch their heads, and Miller's got to scratch his head and figure out how to make the thing work again.
Or he just picks really interesting people to collaborate with.
Sure.
And they've got very strong kind of visions of themselves. The story I would add is when he was working with Mazzucchelli for the first time on the Daredevil Born Again. And I don't know if you remember Born Again, but like much of what makes that arc great is like, Daredevil kind of being broken down and then rebuilding himself psychologically over a number of issues. Originally, Miller planned to have that all happen in one issue. Like he would lose his license, lose his house, end up in the street, and then by the end of the issue, he would sort of kind of get his spirit back again. And he'd be like, I'm ready to, fight, and I know who I am, kind of thing. And then Mazzucchelli said it would be way more interesting if we like slowed this down and really looked at the nitty-gritty of this. Yeah, and that's what makes that series great. And I should also say, like, you got to keep in mind that this is a guy who, while putting out The Dark Knight Returns with Jansen and Varley, is working on Elektra Returns with Sienkiewicz, Born Again with Mazzucchelli. I mean, like, who can do that? To me, that is like freaking brilliant.
Yeah. And I think Mazzucchelli and Gibbons are two of the most controlled artists as well.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. They're the opposite of Darrow.
Yeah.
I think Sienkiewicz is controlled, but you can't tell.
And the opposite of Miller, too.
But Darrow is like, I'm just going to keep drawing until I get tired of it. Yeah, that's true. Totally true. Okay, can we talk, I want to talk about one thing that I did not like, which is, so there are all these splinter factions, and they become quite embarrassing, like the Aryan Thrust, which is this militant, racist, gay militia. White supremacist gay militia, which looking back now and even in 1990, I mean, every time they speak, their leader is called Mr. Crotch, and there's all these, he's constantly talking about, I'm going to grab you by the balls, and he's the ass all the time. I just thought it was so embarrassing. And that's another thing where you look back now at Frank Miller's comments about manliness or whatever, and you're like, oh, this is super embarrassing.
I didn't see it that way. I mean, I can see why it's absolutely politically incorrect. But, I mean, I guess I got to choose my instances where I feel that's warranted and it's not. I don't feel like he's making fun of their manliness. It's just the absurd uncomfortableness of, it's kind of like Hard-Boiled in a sense. There's something very uncomfortable about the places where he goes. And you got to remember, that's in Dark Knight too. Remember those, like Bruno and like the leather-clad Nazis?
Yeah, but I mean, to find a whole, I mean, if you, maybe in life you could find one or two white supremacists, homosexuals, but to find enough hundreds to form, an army.
Sure, but I mean, there's also the militant feminists. Like, if you're gonna
that was next on my list. The First Sex Confederacy, which have bans on sexist remarks and negative role models, which it seems like this is a joke to Miller, like, why would you ban sexist remarks or negative role model? It seems like he thinks that's an extreme thing to ask for. It doesn't seem extreme to me to ask for bans on sexist remarks and negative role models. You know what I mean?
I agree with you. And of course, like, we're being serious, yes, but like in the context of a surreal, near future, I don't think he's criticizing these groups. I think you got to keep in mind, right? This is an America that's falling apart. There's still an America, but it's like so small. It's like, I mean, New York, like the mayor of New York is this guy called Beluga, and then there's like 40 militias in New York all warring just for New York itself. There's the Surgeon General who's like this crazy character. And he's sort of like Jesus-y, like everything should be clean and safe and like sanitized, but he's also like this vicious, like political, like android, and he's got like a huge part of the country. I mean, this is a place where you go to the supermarket and it's got like nuclear smokestacks in the ads, and it's saying, some people are saying like we should be worried about radiation, but they don't know what they're talking about. Go into the supermarket and you pick up like a tomato that's like as big as a boat, and you're like, this is great. Like, I mean, it's a kind of crazy place, and like if we're talking about the militant feminist faction, that was also there in Why the Last Man, in that kind of.
Yeah, but that was one. Yeah, okay, you're totally right. You're right. I think the problem is maybe I'm looking at this through the lens of what I have, the opinions I have formed about Frank Miller in the present, and I'm looking back and going, well, I can kind of see the germs of what would come later in some of the certain depictions of things here.
I see what you're saying. I just don't see a connection there because, I don't know, to me I see a kind of a mind at work here where it's still kind of detached and playfully kind of toying with these various notions and values. It's not really kind of coming out and saying there's a real America and all of these people are lunatic fringes. It's just saying everybody's nuts and let's take every, like, I mean, the leader of of the First Sex Confederacy looks a lot like Clinton, but this would be before her husband was elected. I don't know if you noticed that. And that's Howard Nison's wife, because she divorces him and she starts her own. And I was just thinking, holy crap, like that's so in an odd way, you're right. He's sort of being, he's kind of being a troublemaker or a class clown, and he's saying things that are inappropriate and that shouldn't be said. But on the other hand, I feel like he's sort of also got an artful finger on the pulse of where things might kind of be up in the air. And I think, there's something kind of gutsy and brilliant about this crazy world that he's depicting. It didn't trouble me. Let's put it that way, because you got to keep in mind that Martha is such a natural, just by who she is, without saying I'm a feminist. Just she is like an awesome female role model. Yeah. That's the thing. People slam Miller for his various things, but he created Martha Washington, and he created Elektra, even though Elektra has flaws. And Martha probably does too, because she ultimately doesn't ever engage politically. She just but that's part of the commentary too, I guess.
Yeah, well, that's it. That's kind of an interesting thing too, because PAX, the peacekeeping force itself, is not inherently corrupt, and it's kind of the thing where in this type of fiction you assume that the military itself is kind of festering.
Yeah. I thought if you were going to take issue with anything, I thought you'd take issue with the PAX women like massive Amazon soldiers,
Yeah, that's another thing where I looked at that and I thought, oh, that's every character from Sin City.
Yeah.
And it's literally this Amazonian blonde woman that's been cloned, so she's the same. Everyone was the same. I literally.
Yeah, but I think she's a bit repellent. She's a bit Nurse Ratchety, whereas in Sin City they're all pornographic, Yeah.
Very cynically, as I was reading it, again from my current perspective, I had the very cynical thought that this is, more, Frank Miller's ideal woman, that he's kind of cloned this giant blonde.
I don't think that. I think his ideal woman is Casey McKenna, is Martha Washington.
Yeah.
He's basically a female version of his male iconic characters.
Yeah, for sure. But there are certainly some of the hookers in Sin City looked a lot like. But I will say, in the later Martha Washingtons, there is one of them starts to
take over those.
No. There's one of them falls in love with Martha, has an unrequited secret love for Martha.
Right. Yeah.
Which was a neat thing. Yeah. But yeah, no, I didn't complain about that. I mean, that didn't give me any. I didn't have any second thoughts about that much as the other stuff. Just for fun, can we take a minute to list off any other things? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's a fake kind of Playboy-style pictorial with them in it. So I thought if you're going to be offended by anything, you'd be offended by that.
Right.
Anyway, go on.
I was going to say, for fun, can we name off any other things that you were reminded of while reading Give Me Liberty? Because I listed about 15 other science fiction works that I was like, oh yeah, that reminds me of that and that and that and that.
But stuff that was a predecessor, not
could be
that.
Before or after. So
well, the obvious one is the new Kiefer Sutherland TV show, right?
Okay,
I mean,
yep.
That seems so much like what happens to the Nissen character in this book. So much so that it might even be an influence. Give Me Liberty.
Although that also happens in King Ralph, where where the entire royal family is wiped out at a freak family photo, and John Goodman becomes the King of England.
That's awesome. I have not seen that, but that's
King Ralph. It's the Prince and the Pauper, basically. But anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm thinking of from predating this, I would think A Clockwork Orange for the scene where they reprogram Martha, and prop her eyes open and play music to affect her emotions.
Sure, I would also throw in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yes, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Yeah. Escape from New York. for stuff that came after, like Minority Report, for some reason, Raggedy Ann, the mutant schizophrenic who controls machinery with her psychic powers, reminded me of the mutants they have in the tanks in Minority Report. Judge Dredd, The Cursed Earth storyline with all the Hammer corporations.
Yeah, I thought just the way America is in this book is so much Judge Dredd kind of thing. I just felt like that's a huge influence.
Yeah. Starship Troopers, for some of the military stuff. Idiocracy, because there's a shot at the which you're mentioning about at the grocery store where all the products are gigantic, and in Idiocracy there's a thing where they go through Costco and everything is like the size of cars.
Yeah. But once again, Idiocracy came afterwards, right?
Yes, after. So there's stuff that came after, but I was just like, I was reading this and I was remember like, Waterworld, because like New York floods.
Yeah. Once again, came afterwards.
What else I can do? Yeah, afterwards.
By the way, I just want to say, like, there's this one panel I love where New York is flooded, and then they've got these aqua cabs, and then some lady's beating this guy to, like, get on a boat cab, and it's exactly like New York. And if you look at that panel, like, there's garbage in the water where the boat is, just like in the streets of New York. I mean, it's wonderful.
Yes, that's very much like, that's like a Watchmen type thing with Dave Gibbons loading all of that detail into there. In a sense, he's the only guy that could have drawn this, in the same way he was the only guy that could have drawn Watchmen to make the world as rich as it is.
So let's put Watchmen and Dark Knight as influences.
Yeah, American Flag. I felt like there was some of that in here somehow as well, and that's almost a similar era. And I don't know quite how to pinpoint it, but
what about the Native American stuff? What about maybe Billy Jack or something like that?
Yeah.
You know, Billy Jack.
Yeah, I know, but I feel like that was really, to me, was
original.
Yeah, I didn't really feel like there was a sense of. My brain didn't skip to remember something else when I was reading any of that stuff as much. Halo Jones reminded me of Martha.
Also, there must be movies about people who tried to get out of the ghetto by joining the military. There must be movies about like along that theme that I feel like Miller would have drawn on. I think that's
more like reality.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, you know. Yeah, I'm not sure, but you're right. There must be something. I don't know if it's ever been done with like a black character. Was Born on the 4th of July like that? Did he come out of poverty? I can't remember.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry, I was thinking of, like, to some degree, it's not really a good connection, but to some degree Barry Lyndon is like that. It's such a out of left field thing, but Barry Lyndon falls on hard times, and then he wants to get away, so he joins the army.
Okay.
Wants to get out of the army.
Yeah.
But then there's a line in Barry Lyndon where they're like, you know, King George was too much one of men to heed from where they came. So all these like criminals and people, you know, they were just given a pardon and then joined the British Army, and then they're like burning houses and stealing cattle, and it's a very kind of subtly satirical movie too. So
right,
I just felt like there was some of that.
Right.
Maybe not that movie particularly, but that sensibility.
Yeah.
What about President Rexall as a brain? Is that like Krang from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles?
Oh, I don't know about Krang, but the brain in a jar thing is old. That goes back way back, and I don't know how far. But the thing it calls to mind now is Futurama, where everybody's head is in a jar.
Sure.
Not just the brain, but the whole head, including Nixon, who is president.
Sure.
And he's in a jar. So there's kind of fingerprints all over the place. What about everybody had weird names? Like Rexall, and there's a character called Sphincter, there's a Placebo, there's a Billy Bob Coolant mentioned at one point.
Yeah,
I don't know what to make of it. It's not really consistent or funny, it's just strange.
Well, that's Miller. Like there's a couple of like language tics that he has. Yeah. I mean, besides his writing style and whatever, which we could talk about if you want, which I think he's quite a gifted writer, an amazingly naturally gifted writer. But he goes with these funny names that once again.
Yeah, I think this one is.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say in this book in particular, because there's so many factions of people, these fragmented factions of people that I love the way the Surgeon General speaks. He actually reminded me of the Surgeon General from Escape from L.A. But he's this kind of twisted character, and it's almost inhuman the way he speaks in these very fragmented sentences. And Raggedy Ann, the schizophrenic, speaks in a very specific jargon, which is very hard to understand, but is consistent.
That's the other Miller thing that I think is kind of a tick. Like, she says no lunch often, and that's something that he sort of ascribes to, I don't know, Miller. Like, the thing I don't like the most that Miller kind of does is the way he uses either mentally unusual or unstable characters, and I think he sometimes uses them as like disturbing evil people or whatever. But you remember in year one when Jim Gordon is like new to Gotham, and then there's a schizophrenic or something holding a couple of kids hostage, and he's holding a gun to the kid's head, and he's like, no lunch or something very similar, and then Gordon says, yeah, I'll order takeout, and then, goes and knocks out.
I thought in this, I thought she was saying no launch. That was her way of saying stop the launch.
Yeah, maybe, but she often says no lunch or Ziploc, like as in, I don't know, but it's also very much like the Argo in Dark Knight, where he kind of creates this like futuristic teenage Argo that Carrie Kelly is sort of privy to, but Batman is not. That the mutants kind of speak. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And it's very much in that vein, and I think it's a distinctive Miller thing, and I think it's, once again, it's sort of like what Moore does, like saying something like crossed or, various other things, where it's just Miller doesn't really try to set out to create a new language every time. He just sort of goes for this kind of jaunty, and it's also similar to how like a lot of times his main characters, they're not extremely expressive or loquacious people. They kind of like talk in fragmentary sentences, and they often repeat the same basic urge or something. Right. And I feel like that's kind of like a Miller thing. It's distinctive, and sometimes I really like it, and sometimes, like in this case with Raggy Ann, I don't know, like she's the least relatable of the characters, and I'm wondering, like, she's interesting. What I like about it, I guess... Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, does she have to be relatable? There's already two other relatable leads.
Yeah, I mean, I like the chemistry between the three, because if you didn't have Raggy Ann, you wouldn't have those wonderful humorous moments where she basically says things that each of them are thinking, like, oh my god, his body...
Yes, that's funny.
Or, I have a crush on you, and like, maybe we survive this, we can get to know each other better. No.
Yeah, and Wasserstein has a great line where she says, damn it, this girl's making an ass out of me.
So it's a wonderful dynamic, which I feel is lost in the later books, especially because that, like, what's great about Martha is that she's really capable and she's really intelligent, but she often kind of presents herself as simple, or she thinks of herself as simple. And there are some aspects of her which are just very underdeveloped or are not confident. And one is like in the area of the way she relates to men and her romantic kind of liaisons. And what I love about this first book is there's a kind of an innocence and a charm about that. And to some degree, Wasserstein's too is like, he's not like a confident ladies' man, even though he's extremely capable and like, he's her analog, he's her equal, and they're both. So there's a really nice kind of dynamic, and I like the symbolism of the doll kind of corresponding to Raggy Ann. You've got those wonderful Gibbons covers, and in the first one, she's like the Statue of Liberty, except she's black with dreadlocks, and she's got the mind control, bars around her head instead of the Liberty crown, and she's holding the Raggedy Ann doll, which of course represents her own like innocence and childhood that's been so traumatized and just shredded into scraps because of the circumstances that she's been born into. So I don't know. I'm fine with all of that. In the first book.
Yeah. I have three notes left in my notebook here that I wanted to point out. One is there's a page of Mount Rushmore and Dan Quayle has been added to it, which I love. Even 20 years later, I loved it. Another is a panel where there's a scene in a hotel room where a robot bellhop gets tipped, and I laughed so hard because I thought if you made a robot bellhop, isn't the point that you don't have to pay it because it's a robot and he tips it? I thought that was fun.
I just love the way the general also just talks to him. He's like, "Son, hold my calls. I'm about to hit the like, you need to talk like in that genteel manner to a robot."
Yeah. The last point I wanted to. There's a line in there which I thought was the most prophetic. Maybe it was true even in 1990, I don't know, but I thought it was the most amazing thing maybe in the whole book. So what happens is Nissen, the new president, has been manipulated into authorizing a laser strike on the Apache Nation from space. And the Apache Nation is destroyed. Now, at the start of the fourth issue, I think, we see that the White House, there's all this rioting happening on the lawn of the White House from angry citizens. And the guy gets fried on the fence? I think it's maybe a bit later. Okay, so it's right after the hotel scene. Sure. So maybe it's not. But anyway, there's a line, it's a news report, and it says, strangely, few of the rioting citizens have even heard of the Apache Nation atrocity which left 200 innocents and a race dead. And I just thought that was the most... They don't even know what these citizens, these sheep, don't even know what they're angry about. They're just out there rioting, and they don't even know what triggered it. And that was just the most true thing. Right. Or it's like they've forgotten what happened like a week ago, which to me is, that's exactly what happens all the time now. You forget, there was an earthquake last week that killed 50,000 people. I forgot about that, like it's gone from memory in instants. And I thought that was just totally the greatest thing.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I feel like there's a lot in there. If there's one thing I have to talk about, it's the ending. We should talk about the ending. Sure. I just think it's so powerful. Yeah. I don't know if it's crammed in 2 pages, especially because the last page is basically just, a full-on splash. But what do you, like, at the end, Moretti's finally arrested. She defeats him, and then she goes to visits him in a cell, and he's kind of despondent. And she basically says, "I'll read it, just because it's really powerful."
Yeah, read it.
You know what kind of place I grew up in, Colonel? A lot of people I knew ended up in prison, just like you. And they're just sitting on chairs facing each other. There's nothing separating them. One real good friend I had when I was a kid, he got framed for murder, ended up facing the death penalty. And she starts taking off her belt as she continues talking. They were going to use an antique electric chair on him, not a firing squad like the one you're facing. I visited him in his cell. He asked me for my belt, and I gave it to him. Like I said, I was just a kid. I didn't know why he wanted it until the next morning. I guess the waiting was the worst of it for him. She puts the belt down on the bench beside him. He puts his hands up to his face and just covers his face. Then in the next panel, he's actually crying, looking at her and crying. And also there's the great visual motif of the yellow streak in his hair from the first Amazon encounter, the napalm, the mustard, and she's got yellow hair. So there's that kind of...
And her hair is yellow from that, too.
Yeah, so there's that kind of mirroring. And he says, he's crying, he says, "Don't go. I don't want to be alone when I do it." And she sits down beside him, and this is where that simple thing comes in. But yet there's so much more underneath. She says, "Yes, sir." And then he grabs the belt. And then you flip over the page. That's all on one page. You flip over the page, and you just see him hung by the belt on a pipe. He's hung himself. And she's just sitting there just looking at him with a very kind of pensive look on her face. And then the captions say, "He's brave about it till he kicks the chair, and the belt doesn't break his neck." It doesn't break his neck. He's brave until then. He chokes and gurgles and twitches, and his eyes bulge, and his tongue pokes out, and it takes 10 minutes for him to stop. I listen to his death rattle. Pretty soon now, I'll call the guard. What do you? I think that's such high comics writing.
I think it's amazing. I think it's totally amazing sequence. I don't think 2 pages is rushed. for a couple of reasons.
I don't either.
I think she beat the shit out of him for several pages previously.
Yeah.
And we've been waiting for 4 issues for this guy to get his comeuppance, and he got it when she beat him up. And he went to jail, and we're like, okay, this is all, he got what he deserved already. And now we've got 2 pages, the writing is super tight, there's not a wasted word.
No.
It's
or moment.
And there are silent, like you mentioned, where she puts the belt down, there's silent panels even in those 2 pages. I think it's perfectly paced, and I think earlier in the book there, especially in issue 1, there are some scenes where it's very fast. I think it's almost too fast, where you're like, oh, what happened? And like they skip over stuff, and you've just got to assume this, and this, and it's very quick.
He's sort of like a Hernandez Brothers kind of style at times, where he like does that jarring jump cut thing almost.
Yeah, like when she's released from the institution, and then she's being chased by the health gangs, you're not really, I had to read it 2 times before I figured out, oh, this is what's actually going on here. I thought it was very fast. I found this was for 2 pages, very slowed down. It slowed right down somehow.
And I think that's what I love about Miller the most, maybe. Just he's a master of timing. He can use those panel-to-panel transitions like he knows just the moments to freeze on. And I think that's the consistent thing when he works with other artists. That's the thing, that's the Miller touch for me. Besides the language or whatever, the content, it's that moment-to-moment thing. And he doesn't always do it in this book. Sometimes it's just action sequences. But when he does that moment-to-moment thing, he does it so beautifully and gracefully and so powerfully.
Yeah.
You know, the language, the comics language, and his own written abilities are just working together so incredibly.
Yeah.
And it's just so, like, it's the fact that she went and just sat with him. You know,
and she called him sir.
Yeah. And she was resigned to it. Like, she's a young woman, but she's also like this ancient woman who understands this is the way the world works. And I can't really change it. I can only survive. I'm not going to let it kill me. I can only keep my integrity and just survive. And that in itself is like a triumph. And there's something almost kind about the way she helps him. Like, she helps him, but she also, like, sees that he kills himself and lets him suffer. Like, there's such a juxtaposition there. Like, it's just...
And not only that, she's going to look at his dead body. She says, pretty soon now I'll call the guard. She's not just going to walk out. She's just going to sit there and look at his dead body for a while.
She's going to savor it. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I guess the question I have to ask you is, have I at all moved the needle in terms of your ambivalence towards Frank Miller, or, you know, what can we say about his legacy? Or what can I get you to say about his legacy?
Look, the needle hasn't moved because the problem is not the legacy. I love Dark Knight. I love Year One. I love Hard Boiled to Death. I love Sin City 1 and 2. I love this book anyway before rereading it twice for this episode. Those were never the issue. And I still don't like the later Sin Cities. I still don't like the later Martha Washingtons. I still will not even look at the current stuff. That hasn't moved. The thing that's the controversy is that I'm not as much a fan of Daredevil as everyone else in the world is.
Sure.
That's the thing that sticks in everyone's gullet. So that hasn't changed by reading Martha Washington.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but anyway, it's a great book and it remains a great book. And I think that's probably the final word. I don't know. You want to add anything else?
Unless you want to say anything about the U.S. election, what does it look like from your corner of the world? I mean, I'm not really, like, I don't know how much I'm going to be affected by it, but are you affected at all?
I will. I'll be interested to see if Tim actually leaves this in or cuts it out. We will be, of course, there will be a trickle-down effect. Whatever happens there affects us here. But in terms of what I see now, like, I don't watch the news a lot, so all I get is my Facebook feed, and I don't have any Trump people in my Facebook feed. And honestly, 6 months ago, it was like, oh, Bernie Sanders is going to be president. How could it be any other way? And then it was like, now it's just like, you know, it's going to be, but my source of information is my Facebook friends. So that's the demographic. That, so I don't really have an opinion. It just seems, but I did feel, I don't know if should I really say this aloud for the record? It might not end up in the episode, but, my feeling is after.
How many people listen to our podcast anyway? Sorry, Tim.
Three people.
Okay.
So,
Me, you,
my
and
thing
who's
is-
the other person, Tim?
Tim, yep. So my thing is, if since that tape came out with Trump on that bus, my feeling is Clinton should release her Wall Street speeches, because surely they couldn't have been any worse.
Well, I mean, I think
That's my 5 cents.
Yeah.
Just
I mean, if I could add 2 cents to that and make it 7 cents, I would just think like it's like the mood is like, okay, we'll take her, you know, like we'll.
no, I think it is, but I think some people are really pro Clinton. But I'm like, don't you remember stuff we were saying about her 6 months ago? Like, we still don't know what was in those Wall Street speeches. Like, can we?
But what I'm saying is like she's wanted this so badly,
Sure.
and it is pretty amazing to finally bring America in line with, you know, much of the world, and to have like a woman head of state. But is this the kind of the tenor, the tone of things that she wants to kind of assume that historic role in, as like, okay, we'll take you because
It's you remember? I don't know if you recall this, but was it 4 years ago or 8 years ago? Maybe it was before Obama. There was speculation that it was going to be Clinton versus Condoleezza Rice. That time, that would have been really pretty amazing. Yeah, I don't know. It's just she's in there because it's, you know, it's the lesser of two evils. Except one is just a ball of shit, not really, you know, beyond. I wouldn't even call evil, and the other one is I wouldn't call evil, but I would call sinister.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any, but you know, maybe that's what every president is like. Is there such a thing as a good president, really? You know, the one you like is Jimmy Carter, and he was the most ineffectual. You know, he's done his best work after being president, and maybe, you know, Bernie Sanders will do his best in the Senate, not as a president, where they would turn him into a drunk and then all gang up and stab him in the back before they built the White House.
Political opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and don't necessarily reflect the opinion of Deconstructing Comics. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or look us up on Patreon, Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, and YouTube. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. Our theme is from bensound.com. Mulele's Kickstarter project for Mindgator number 2 only has about a week to go, and he needs your support to make his goal. Get all the details at mulele.com. Right behind this episode in the podcast feed, you'll find the 100th episode of Critiquing Comics. Mulele and I dig into a bunch of comics we got at Kaigai, plus some left over from Mocha last spring. This coming Thursday on To the Bat Polls, we're joined by John S. Drew of the Batcave podcast to discuss Lorenzo Semple Jr.'s scripts for the Riddler and Penguin story arcs that began Season 1. What do they tell us about Semple's approach to the show, his ideas that were carried on by other writers, and those that ended up on the cutting room floor? Look up To the Bat Polls wherever you find your podcasts, or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com. Next week on this show, Emmett and John will be here to talk about Wonder Woman Earth 1, as well as the announcement of Wonder Woman as a United Nations ambassador, and about the history of the character, so be here next week for that. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.